The funniest person at our Thanksgiving table stopped laughing the second the DNA app refreshed. For 23 years, my family had one joke, and it was me. By the time the results loaded on our phones, I already knew something was wrong, not just because Ryan's grin slipped for the first time in my life, but because my mother looked like a woman watching a house fire she had smelled smoke from weeks ago and never warned anyone about. Ryan was sitting across from me with his phone in one hand and a beer in the other, still half smiling, still expecting the moment to land exactly the way he'd imagined it. My dad was beside him, leaning back in his chair with that satisfied, lazy expression he always got when Ryan was entertaining the room for him. My Aunt Linda was already laughing before anyone had even said anything, because in my family, the idea of me not belonging had been funny for so long that people started reacting to the setup before they even heard the punchline. Then Ryan looked down again, and the smile vanished. Not faded, vanished, like someone had wiped it off his face with a wet cloth. He blinked once, then twice. His thumb moved over the screen, like maybe he could swipe his way into a different outcome. My dad leaned over to see what he was looking at, and for the first time that night, my father's face changed too. It tightened in a strange, ugly way. Not confusion, not exactly. More like the expression you make when a private fear walks into the room and sits down in front of everybody. Nobody was looking at me anymore. That was new. For most of my life, when people in my family laughed, their eyes landed on me. At birthday parties, school events, Christmas dinners, backyard cookouts, they all knew where to look when the joke was about who didn't match the rest of the set. Me. Always me. My brother Ryan had my dad's jaw, my mom's eyes, my dad's shoulders, my grandfather's smile, and somehow the confidence of a man who'd been told from birth that the world already agreed with him. I got none of that. I had darker hair than either of my parents. Different skin tone. Different build. Different face. Different everything apparently, because strangers used to study me at family barbecues like I was some bonus child who'd wandered in from next door and grabbed a hot dog. When I was little, adults tried to be subtle about it. That didn't last. By the time I was 10, Ryan had turned it into his favorite hobby. "You sure you weren't switched at birth?" he used to ask, grinning like he'd invented comedy. Sometimes it was the mailman. Sometimes the UPS guy. Once it was our dentist, which didn't even make sense, but the room still laughed. My parents laughed hardest. That was the part that stayed with me. Kids say cruel things because they're kids. Adults are supposed to be the wall that cruelty bounces off. In my house, they were the sound system. If someone outside the family said I looked different, my parents never corrected them. Not once. They would smile, shrug, let the joke breathe. Let me stand there and feel my face getting hot while everybody else enjoyed themselves. Ryan learned early that if mom and dad laughed, nothing was off limits. So he kept going. And because nobody ever stopped him, he got better at it. He knew exactly when to use it too. Not on random Tuesdays. Not when nobody was paying attention. He liked an audience. At my 8th grade award ceremony, when I won a writing prize and my teacher shook my hand in front of the room, Ryan leaned over to my dad and said, loud enough for the row behind us to hear, "Guest talent skipped the family genes." My dad laughed like he was proud of him. At my high school graduation, my uncle squinted at me while I crossed the stage and asked my mom, "Whose kid is that again?" Everybody around them laughed. I heard it from the podium. That one stayed with me longer than I like to admit, because there's something special about being humiliated while wearing a cap and gown. You spend years working for a moment, and somehow your family still finds a way to make it feel borrowed. Things got worse after I got into college. Not because I left, because I got into a better one than Ryan had. Ryan had always been the family favorite, but he was never the smartest person in the room. He didn't need to be. He was good-looking, charming when it benefited him, and naturally athletic in the exact way my father worshipped. He played sports, knew how to slap backs and hold eye contact, and make older relatives feel important. My family treated that like character. I studied. That was apparently suspicious. When my acceptance letter came, along with a scholarship that cut my tuition almost in half, I thought maybe for once they'd just say congratulations. That maybe real achievement would be stronger than an old joke. Instead, my dad took the letter from my hand, skimmed it, and said, "Well, I guess you got the brains from whoever your real father is." My mother laughed so hard she nearly spilled her wine. You would think there's a point where a joke dies. There isn't, not when the joke gives the right people exactly what they want. And what they wanted was a family shape that made sense to them. Ryan in the center. Me at the edge. Ryan as proof. Me as question mark. Ryan as the son who reflected them back to themselves. Me as the odd detail they could all bond over. That dynamic got baked into everything. At family dinners, Ryan sat next to my dad without discussion. I got whichever chair was left, usually at the end of the table near the kitchen door, where people stood up mid-conversation and brushed past me to refill drinks. If my dad needed help with something outside, he called Ryan. If there was a story from when the boys were little, it was always about Ryan. If there was a comparison, I lost before it started. The weird thing is that after enough years, you stop asking for fairness. You downgrade your expectations so many times they become manners. I learned how to laugh half a second after everybody else, so no one had to feel awkward for me. I learned how to make my face blank. I learned that if you answer cruelty with silence, people call you mature, which is a very flattering word for what is actually emotional exhaustion. I also learned something else. Families love a role. Once they assign you one, they defend it harder than the truth. Mine had assigned me the maybe not really one of us kid, and once that part was written, every difference became evidence. The fact that I hated sports when Ryan loved them. Evidence. The fact that I liked books and stayed thin while he filled out like my dad did. Evidence. The fact that I got quiet when rooms got loud instead of trying to own them the way Ryan did. Evidence. Nobody ever stopped to consider that personality isn't a paternity test. By the time we were adults, the joke had become tradition. And traditions are dangerous because people stop hearing what they're actually saying. They just repeat it because repetition feels like permission. Last Christmas, Ryan decided the tradition needed a finale. We were at my parents' house, all of us wedged around the dining table with overcooked ham, dry rolls, too much red wine, and the same old hierarchy dressed up as holiday warmth. Ryan had this smug, restless energy that night, the kind he gets when he's been sitting on an idea he thinks is brilliant. He waited until everyone had plates in front of them, and my aunt had started her second glass before leaning back and saying he had a family bonding activity. That phrase alone should have worried me. Ryan never wanted bonding. Ryan wanted performance. He reached under the table, pulled out a stack of boxes, and started handing them around like party favors. DNA kits. He was smiling before he even explained it. I figured, he said, we can finally settle this once and for all. Nobody asked what this was. They all knew. A couple of relatives laughed immediately. My dad smiled. My cousin Nate muttered, "Oh, this should be good," like he was settling in for a show. Ryan slid one of the boxes toward me with 2 fingers, like he was pushing chips into the middle of a poker table. "I can't wait," he said, "to prove once and for all that I'm 100% Dad's kid and figure out which mailman this one belongs to." That got a bigger laugh than it deserved. It usually did. I remember looking down at the box and feeling something colder than embarrassment. Embarrassment had burned out years ago. This was something flatter. More tired. Like even the humiliation had become repetitive. Same punchline. Bigger props. I almost said no. Not because I was scared of the results. At that point, I honestly didn't care what they said. When a joke has been used on you long enough, part of you starts to think the official answer might almost be a relief. At least it would end the guessing. At least there'd be a document. A percentage. A screen. Something colder and cleaner than years of people smirking over dinner rolls. But before I could say anything, I noticed my mother. That was the first crack. Ryan was grinning, my dad was amused, my aunt was already reading the instructions out loud like she was hosting a game night, but my mother had gone very still. Not offended, not annoyed, still. It was subtle enough that I probably would have missed it if I hadn't spent half my life studying small changes in people's faces before they said things that hurt me. She was holding her wine glass in the same position, but she wasn't drinking from it. Her eyes were fixed on the kit in Ryan's hand. Not mine. His. Just for a second. Then she looked away so fast it could have meant nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. "Do we really need to waste money on this?" she asked, and her voice came out thinner than I expected. That room should have stopped right there. It didn't. My dad laughed and waved his hand like she was being dramatic. "Oh, come on. It's fun. Fun." That word landed hard. Because there are families who use that word when they mean games and music and pie and stories from when everyone was younger. My family used it when they meant someone would leave the table feeling smaller than when they sat down. Ryan kept passing the kits around. He was energized now, encouraged by my dad's reaction, by the audience, by habit. That's the thing about people like Ryan. They don't need truth. They need momentum. If enough people are nodding, they treat it like moral approval. He dropped my kit directly in front of me. "Relax," he said. "Maybe you'll get lucky and find out you're related to someone rich." More laughter. I looked at my mother again. Still too quiet. And for the first time in 23 years, it occurred to me that maybe the person most uncomfortable with the joke was not the person it had been aimed at. That thought should have changed everything for me immediately. It didn't. Because when people have spent your whole life teaching you that you're the obvious answer, you don't automatically start looking for a different question. So I took the swab. Everybody did. We passed tubes, spit into little plastic funnels, snapped lids shut, sealed envelopes. Ryan made comments the entire time, half to me, half to the room, clearly loving the theater of it. My dad kept chuckling. My aunt said this was hilarious. My cousin asked whether we should all make predictions before mailing them in. Nobody looked at my mother. Maybe they didn't want to. Maybe they didn't notice what I noticed. Or maybe they were too used to her silence to treat it as information. I remember sealing my sample and thinking that even if the results came back exactly the way everyone expected, something had shifted anyway. Just a little. A hairline fracture. My mother's face had done that. Not enough to stop the night. Just enough to make me wonder whether the joke had lasted this long because it was true or because it had been useful. That question sat with me for weeks. Longer really. The kits got mailed. Life went back to normal. Ryan kept being Ryan. My dad kept calling him my boy, in that full, proud voice men like him reserve for sons who make them feel reflected. My mother went back to hosting dinners and asking neutral questions and pretending nothing in the room ever had teeth. I went back to work, to classes, to pretending I had better things to think about. But once a question gets under your skin, it doesn't stay polite. It grows. I started replaying old moments differently. My mother shutting down certain jokes a beat too late. The way she never started them herself, even though she always laughed when other people did. The way Ryan was protected from everything, not just consequences, but discomfort. The way my father's pride in him sometimes felt less natural than desperate. Not desperate enough for me to understand it then. Just strange enough that, by the time Thanksgiving came and the app told us our results were ready, I was carrying around a quiet feeling I couldn't name. Not hope. Definitely not fear. Something sharper. Like I had been standing in the wrong room my whole life and was about to hear voices through the wall. So that Thanksgiving, when Ryan raised his beer and said, "All right, gentlemen, time to meet the mailman," everyone laughed one more time. Everyone except my mother. And when the results finally loaded, it took less than 10 seconds for the room to forget I had ever been the punchline. Because Ryan stared at his screen like it had insulted him personally. My father reached for the phone. My mother closed her eyes. And I looked down at my own results, then back up at the three of them, and realized the joke that built my childhood had just turned around and bitten the wrong son. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. That was the strangest part. Not the results. Not Ryan's face. Not even the way my father suddenly looked 10 years older under the dining room light. It was the silence. My family did not do silence. My family filled every awkward pause with a joke, a jab, a fake laugh, some little performance to make sure nobody had to sit too close to anything real. But there was no joke ready for this. Ryan looked up first. "This is wrong," he said. Not confused. Not shaken. Angry. He said it in the same tone he used when a waiter brought him the wrong drink or a parking app charged him twice. Like the problem wasn't reality. The problem was customer service. My dad held out his hand for the phone without saying a word. Ryan gave it to him, but only halfway, like he still thought he could pull it back if my father's eyes landed on the screen for too long. Dad stared at it. I watched his mouth move once, almost like he was reading the numbers silently to himself, trying to force them into a shape he could survive. Then he handed the phone back. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to, because by then my Aunt Linda had already asked, "What? What does it say?" Ryan didn't answer her. He looked at my father. My father looked at my mother. And that was the moment the room changed for me. Not when Ryan stopped smiling. Not when my dad went pale. When he looked at her. Straight at her. Like he wasn't asking a question for the first time. Like he was revisiting one. I looked down at my own phone. I still remember exactly how the screen looked. White background. Clean layout. A stupidly calm interface for a result that felt like it should have come with an explosion sound. At the top, it showed close family matches. Under my mother's name, a parent-child match. Under my father's name, another parent-child match. Not maybe. Not likely. Parent-child. Clear. Direct. Boring even. I was theirs. Completely, undeniably, scientifically theirs. Then I looked over at Ryan's screen in his hand. He moved it too late. Long enough for me to catch the line under my mother's name. Parent-child. And under my father's? Nothing like that. Half-sibling match to me. Maternal connection. Shared mother. No paternal parent-child match. No 100% dad's kid. No room left for the mailman jokes. Just a bright, clean little screen calmly telling the room that the wrong son had been carrying the family name like a weapon. Aunt Linda laughed once. Just once. A weird, nervous bark of a laugh. The kind people make when they still think maybe a punchline is coming to rescue them. Then she stopped when nobody joined in. "What does that mean?" she asked. Still nobody answered. Ryan's face had gone blotchy around the cheeks. "It means the test is messed up," he snapped. "That's what it means. These things screw up all the time." "Do they?" I asked. I didn't mean to say it out loud, but after 23 years of swallowing every ugly thing that room threw at me, the words came out before I could decide whether they were smart. Ryan turned toward me, so fast his chair legs scraped the floor. "Don't," he said. That got everybody's attention, because Ryan was used to me taking it. He was not used to me answering back. I looked at him, really looked at him. The golden child. The real son. My father's favorite reflection. The guy who'd been dining out on my humiliation since middle school. And for the first time in my life, I saw what happens to a man when the story that built his personality gets yanked away in public. He had nothing underneath it but panic. "You mean don't what?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "Don't act like you know what this says." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was obscene. This man had spent years telling me exactly what my face supposedly proved. And now he wanted caution? He wanted careful interpretation? He wanted room for nuance? That was rich. My cousin Nate leaned in from the other side of the table. "Wait, hold on," he said. "So he's still your mom's, right?" Nobody corrected the wording. Nobody said son. Nobody said child. Just your mom's. The whole room had slipped into that ugly, stunned place people go when scandal starts reorganizing the furniture in their heads. Ryan ignored him. "Dad." That one word came out wrong. Not confident. Not automatic. Not the easy, entitled dad he'd used his whole life. It sounded younger. Smaller. My father rubbed a hand over his mouth. Let me see it again. Ryan passed him the phone again, this time with both hands, almost like he was offering evidence to a judge. Dad stared longer this time. Then he looked at my phone, and I handed it over before he asked. He compared the screens. Me. Him. Ryan. Me again. It was probably less than 30 seconds. It felt like the entire structure of our house had been disassembled beam by beam in front of us. My Aunt Linda whispered, "Oh my God." My mother stood up, so suddenly her chair bumped the wall. "I'm getting more wine," she said. Nobody believed that for a second. She hadn't finished the glass already in her hand. My father turned toward her. "Sit down." I had never heard that tone from him directed at her. Not once. My parents had one of those marriages built on routines and omissions. They weren't warm exactly, but they had the polished, practiced rhythm of people who knew which subjects to avoid and called that stability. I'd seen my father impatient, annoyed, dismissive, but this was different. This had steel in it. My mother froze. Not sat down. Froze. Ryan looked between them, and I watched the realization start to work through him in stages. First denial, then outrage, then that awful little dawning recognition that the room was no longer organized around protecting his ego. It was organizing itself around a question, and that question had his name in it. "What is this?" he asked, but he wasn't talking to me anymore, or even to my dad. He was looking at my mother. She tried one last week, move toward normal. "Those kits aren't always accurate." "Stop," my father said. The whole table went still again. Then Ryan laughed. It was a terrible sound. Thin. Forced. Cracking in the middle. "Okay," he said. "Okay, no. This is insane. So what, you're all just going to sit there and pretend this means something? I'm standing right here. I'm your son." Nobody answered fast enough. That silence hit him harder than anything on the screen. Because for the first time, he heard what I'd heard all my life. The pause before belonging. My Aunt Linda looked at my dad, then at my mom, then decided with breathtaking cowardice that her mashed potatoes were suddenly fascinating. My cousin Nate kept glancing between Ryan and me like he was watching a tennis match he hadn't paid for, but was now deeply invested in. Somebody at the far end of the table actually muttered, "Jesus Christ," under their breath. My father finally stood up. He wasn't a dramatic man. He didn't slam hands on tables or yell for effect. That made it worse. When men like him go quiet, the air gets dangerous. He placed both palms flat on the table and looked at my mother. "How long?" he asked. That was it. 2 words. No accusation. No screaming. No details. Just how long. Not "is this true?" Not "what happened?" How long. Which meant one thing very clearly. This was not the first time the thought had crossed his mind. My mother's face changed in a way I will never forget. Not because she looked guilty. Guilt would have been cleaner. She looked tired. Like a person who had spent years holding a door shut from the inside and had finally heard the lock snap. "Don't do this here," she said softly. Ryan stared at her, then at my father, then back at her. And I think that was the exact second it became real to him, because his whole posture changed. Up to that point, he had still been performing outrage, still treating it like a technical glitch. But when my mother didn't deny it immediately, the performance died. He took one step back from the table. "No," he said. "Just that. No." Like a child refusing medicine. My father didn't raise his voice. "Answer the question." My mother looked at the relatives, at the plates, at the half-finished dinner, at the dumb little centerpiece she'd arranged in the middle of the table. "Anywhere but at him." "This is not the time," she said. Ryan's voice came out sharp enough to cut glass. "Mom." That made her look at him. And once she did, I saw the worst thing of all. Pity. Not confusion. Not maternal reassurance. Not outrage that anyone would question him. Pity. It landed on him like a slap. "Mom," he said again, louder now, and his whole face was red. "Say something." She opened her mouth, closed it. Then my father laughed. Just once. Low and humorless. I had heard my father laugh at my expense more times than I could count. At my graduation, at dinner, at Christmas, at every lazy little remark Ryan made about my face, my body, my brain, my place in the family. That laugh had always meant safety for Ryan. Approval. Permission. This laugh meant the exact opposite. "You fought me on the test," my father said, staring at my mother like the room no longer existed. "You said it was a waste of money." She didn't answer. He nodded once, slowly, putting pieces together in real time. "You knew." At that, she finally spoke. "I suspected." That hit the table like a grenade. Ryan flinched. Actually flinched. My Aunt Linda sucked in a breath, so loud it was almost theatrical. Cousin Nate dropped his fork. I just sat there, hands still around my phone, and felt something cold and strange move through me. Not satisfaction, not yet. Something closer to vindication, stripped joy. Because when the truth finally arrived, it didn't feel triumphant. It felt filthy. Ryan shook his head. No, what does that even mean?" "Suspected what?" My mother looked like she wanted to lie. You could see the shape of it passing through her. One last attempt. One last soft version. One last patch over a hole that had been widening for decades. Then she must have seen our faces. My father's fury. Ryan's panic. Mine. And maybe for the first time in years, she realized there was no joke big enough to smother this one. "There was a period," she said carefully, "before your father and I got married." My father slammed his palm against the table. "Not hard enough to break anything. Hard enough to stop the sentence." "No," he said. "Don't you dare try to soften this with timeline language." Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed normally. He pointed at Ryan's phone. "Is he my son or not?" Ryan made this strangled sound, halfway between anger and fear. "Dad." My father didn't look at him. That was brutal. Maybe the most brutal part of the night. He didn't even look at him. My mother's eyes filled, but she still didn't cry. She had probably used up all her tears years ago in private, long before the consequences arrived. Some people do their grieving in advance, and call that suffering enough. It isn't. "I don't know," she whispered. Ryan stared at her like she had spoken a foreign language. "You don't know," he repeated. "I was never certain," she said. That sentence broke him more than any insult could have. Because Ryan had built his entire identity on certainty. He was the proof. The obvious one. The son who never had to wonder. The one who weaponized resemblance like a birthright. And now, the only answer he was getting from the person who could have defended him was maybe. Maybe. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered him sliding that DNA kit across the Christmas table with 2 fingers and telling me maybe I'd find out I was related to someone rich. I remembered my father joking that I got my brains from whoever my real father is. I remembered my mother laughing. And the sympathy died right there. Ryan looked at me then. Really looked at me. I knew what he saw because I could feel it myself. For the first time in his life, he was standing in my spot. Not physically, socially, emotionally, existentially. He was the one people were studying now. The one they were measuring against the room. The one with the new question mark hanging over his head. He hated me for that instantly. "You knew?" he asked. The question sounded insane, but in Ryan's world, blame had always been a reflex. If he was humiliated, somebody had done it to him. I stared back at him. "About your results?" "No." He took a step toward me. "This is your fault." That was so ridiculous that even Aunt Linda looked up. "My fault." I said. "You pushed this," he snapped. I actually laughed then. Not a fake social laugh. Not a little exhale. A real one. Short and sharp and ugly with disbelief. "I pushed this." I said. "You handed out the kits." He looked ready to lunge across the table. You've always hated this family. No, I said, and my own voice surprised me because it came out calm. I hated being your punchline. That landed hard because it was true, and truth sounds different in rooms built on habit. Ryan's mouth opened, then shut. He had no line ready for that. No joke. No comeback. No way to turn it into banter. He looked around the table for backup, for one of those little family laughs that always used to float him back to the top whenever he said something cruel. Nothing came. Not from my father. Not from my mother. Not from anybody. And once Ryan realized the room wasn't rushing to save him, he did what men like him always do when admiration dries up. He got vicious. He looked straight at my mother and said, "Who is he?" Nobody needed clarification. She pressed her lips together. "Who is he?" Ryan said again, louder now. "If Dad's not my father, then who is?" My father finally looked at him then, but there was no comfort in it. Only rage, old and fresh at the same time, like this was a wound he had suspected under the skin for years and had just watched somebody slice open in public. My mother sat down slowly. That scared me more than if she'd started crying, because it looked like surrender. And when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I never wanted this to come out like this." Ryan let out a broken laugh. "That's your concern." She ignored him and looked at my father instead. It was a long time ago. There it was again. That weak, useless attempt to make betrayal sound dusty enough to hurt less. My father leaned back like he physically couldn't stand too close to her anymore. "Name him." She shook her head. "Name him," he said again. She looked down at her hands. And that was when I understood the night still had another layer. Because her silence no longer looked like shame alone. It looked like calculation. There was something else in it. Something she still didn't want said out loud. Ryan saw it too. His voice dropped. "Mom, who is he?" My mother's fingers tightened around the stem of her wineglass until I honestly thought it might snap. Then she said, "Someone you know." The room exploded. Aunt Linda was the first. Oh my God. Cousin Nate actually stood up. My father's chair scraped backward. Ryan just stared at her with this blank, stunned face, like his brain had finally exceeded capacity and shut the lights off. "Someone you know. Not a stranger. Not some faceless old mistake from before the marriage. Someone we knew. Someone who had probably been in our house. At our holidays. In photographs. Someone who may have shaken my father's hand and watched Ryan grow up under the wrong name." And suddenly the DNA results weren't the whole disaster. They were just the door. I sat there listening to the noise rise around me, and through all of it, one thought kept pushing its way to the front. My family had spent 23 years making me carry a question they should have been asking somewhere else. And they had done it on purpose. Nobody at that table cared about dessert anymore. My aunt had spent all afternoon talking about the pecan pie like it was the emotional centerpiece of the holiday. There were candles lit, napkins folded. My mother had used the good serving dishes. Hours of work sat around us in ceramic bowls and glass trays. And suddenly, the whole table looked ridiculous. Like a stage set after the actors forgot their lines and started confessing real crimes. "Someone we know," my father repeated. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. That sentence sounded worse coming from him quietly, like he was forcing himself not to rip the room apart with his hands. My mother still wouldn't look up. Ryan took a shaky breath. "Who?" No answer. "Who?" he said again, louder now, and there was no swagger left in him at all. That was gone, burned off. What was left sounded raw, young, hurt in the simplest possible way. My mother pressed her lips together. My father laughed again, that ugly, airless laugh that had nothing funny in it. Unbelievable. Then he started naming people. Not accusing, exactly. Just dragging old ghosts into the light, one by one. Was it Greg? My mother said nothing. Was it Thomas? Still nothing. Was it your boss from the insurance office? That made a few relatives blink, because clearly some people at the table were learning there had been chapters to my mother's life they had never been told. My Aunt Linda looked like she desperately wanted to ask questions, but didn't know whether curiosity still counted as rudeness once the family was already on fire. Ryan stood up so fast his chair tipped backward. "I asked you a question." My mother flinched. That was new too. Ryan had always been loud, confident, entitled, but I had never seen him sound dangerous to her. Or maybe I just hadn't known what I was hearing before. Maybe power sounds different when it stops flowing in the usual direction. "Sit down," my father said. Ryan ignored him. "Was it somebody from church?" he demanded. "One of Dad's friends? One of our neighbors? Who?" I should probably tell you this was the point where I stood up and tried to calm everyone down, or said something wise, or walked away, because I was better than the scene in front of me. I didn't. I stayed exactly where I was. And a part of me, the part they had built with 23 years of jokes and shrugs and public little humiliations, wanted every second of it. Not because I enjoy watching people suffer, because I had watched them enjoy mine. That changes a person. It especially changes the part of you that's supposed to feel noble in family emergencies. My cousin Nate righted Ryan's chair and then stepped back immediately, like even touching the furniture now could get him blamed for something. Aunt Linda kept glancing between my mother and father with a kind of horrified focus people only have when they're witnessing the exact kind of scandal they'll later describe as just heartbreaking, to make themselves sound kinder than they were in the moment. My father stopped naming names and just stared at my mother. Then he said something that made my skin prickle. I knew it. The room went still again. My mother finally looked up. "You did not." I knew something was off. That is not the same thing. He took a step toward her. I spent years telling myself I was crazy. Ryan stared at him. "What are you talking about?" My father kept looking at my mother. "I'm talking about the fact that when he was born," he pointed not at me, but at Ryan, "you wouldn't let anyone say he didn't look like me." No one moved. My Aunt Linda's mouth fell open a little. My father went on. "Everybody says babies don't look like anything at first. Fine. But every time somebody joked he had your nose, or your grandfather's face, or anybody but me, you'd shut it down. Every single time." My mother's voice turned hard for the first time all night. "Because he was your son." My father's eyes didn't leave her. "Was he?" That shut her up. Ryan looked between them like the floor had split underneath him, and they were both calmly discussing the crack instead of helping him climb out. "Dad," he said, and that word sounded fragile now. "You seriously thought this? This whole time?" My father rubbed his hand across his jaw. "Not this whole time. Not every day. But enough. Enough." What a brutal word. Not certainty. Not accusation. Just enough. Enough to sit in the back of a man's mind for years. Enough to notice what other people didn't. Enough to make sense of my mother's silence when Ryan brought out the test kits. Ryan looked sick. And here's the part nobody warns you about when truth finally tips over in a family. It doesn't land neatly on the guilty people. It splashes. It hits everyone. It runs backward through old memories and stains scenes you thought were settled. Suddenly childhood stories are evidence. Wedding photos are evidence. Old friends, old jobs, old jokes, old timing, old absences, old holidays. All of it starts rearranging itself under this new light. My mother must have seen it happening in all our faces. Because she said, "You are making this uglier than it has to be." That was such an insane sentence that even my Aunt Linda found her courage long enough to say, "Carol, I really don't think anyone here is doing that except you." My mother turned toward her slowly, like she couldn't believe she'd just been challenged by someone who normally specialized in saying, "Let's all calm down," and hiding behind side dishes. I almost appreciated Aunt Linda for that. Almost. Ryan laughed again, but this time there was nothing performative in it. It sounded hollowed out. "Uglier? Mom, I just found out at Thanksgiving that I might not be Dad's kid." My mother winced at might. That mattered, because she still wanted the sentence to stay soft. unfinished. Maybe if no one said the hardest version out loud, she could still survive in the gap between suspicion and confession. But the room had moved past that. My father said, "Name him. Right now." She looked at him for a long second and asked, very quietly, "Do you really want to do this in front of everyone?" He answered just as quietly, "You let this happen in front of everyone." That line landed so cleanly it almost felt rehearsed. Maybe it had been waiting in him for years. Ryan turned to my mother again. "Tell me." "Nothing." "Tell me who he is." Still nothing. Then my cousin Nate, who had spent most of his life being the harmless guy who brought beer and stayed out of tension, said, "Was it Uncle Dan?" The whole table jolted. Even me. Because until that second, we had all been thinking around the same vague shape. Old boyfriend, family friend, somebody from before. But Nate had done something far worse. He had picked a face. A real one. Someone who had been in our house. Someone close enough to have a title. My mother snapped her head toward him so fast the answer was practically written in the movement. "No," she said. Too quickly. Too sharply. Not the flat denial of somebody hearing nonsense. The panicked denial of somebody trying to kill a line of thought before it reaches the right door. My father saw it too. His entire body stiffened. "Dan," he said. My mother stood up again. No, he took another step toward her. "My brother." No, but now the words sounded weaker. Less like a denial and more like a prayer. The room started doing that awful family thing where everybody looks down at once because eye contact would mean admitting they are still participating. Aunt Linda covered her mouth. Nate looked like he wanted to climb out a window. Someone near the end of the table whispered, "Jesus, Carol." Again, and this time there was nothing performative in it. Ryan was staring at my mother like he'd never seen her before. "Is it Uncle Dan?" She shook her head. "Then why did you react like that?" No answer. "Why did you react like that?" Still nothing. My father looked like he was about 2 seconds away from smashing a plate just to make the world match the inside of his head. "Answer him." My mother closed her eyes. It was not Dan. That should have settled it. It didn't. Because by then everyone had understood the real issue wasn't only who it was. It was how long she had been willing to let false certainty poison the wrong child to protect the right lie. And that, finally, brought the whole thing back to me. Not because I needed the attention. Because the room itself shifted. People began to remember me. Not as the original topic of the joke, but as collateral damage with a pulse. Aunt Linda looked at me, then really looked at me. And I could see the exact second the math hit her. 23 years. Birthday dinners. School events. The stupid comments. My dad's little lines. Ryan's bigger ones. My mother smiling just enough to keep the peace. And all of it running at full volume while she apparently sat on a suspicion that should have ended the whole thing before it began. She looked horrified. Good. She should have. My cousin Nate looked at me next, and unlike Linda, he didn't even try to dress his expression up as concern. It was guilt, plain and obvious. He'd laughed too. They all had. Even the quieter ones. Even the so-called decent ones. That's how family cruelty works. Only 1 or 2 people need to be actively cruel. The rest just need to enjoy not being the target. Ryan noticed them looking at me. And because humiliation had always made him meaner, not wiser, he immediately turned poisonous. "Oh, don't," he said, glaring around the table. "Don't start looking at him like he's some victim now." Now. That word almost made me smile. Now. As if victimhood had just been invented, because his results came back wrong. I leaned back in my chair and said, "A little late for that, isn't it?" He turned to me. "You love this." There it was. Another classic Ryan move. If he's bleeding, then whoever notices the blood must be cruel. I held his stare. No, I just don't have to pretend this is funny anymore. He actually took a step toward me. My father blocked him without even looking at him fully. That moment mattered more than anyone else there probably understood. Because my father had never once stepped between Ryan and me before. Not when it was verbal. Not when it was subtle. Not when it was humiliating. He had spent my entire life treating Ryan's cruelty like confidence. And now, with one arm extended just slightly, he was telling the room something he had never told it before. Not this time. Ryan noticed too. "Are you serious?" he said to my dad. "You're protecting him?" My father finally turned his head and looked at him. I can't describe that expression in one word because it wasn't one thing. Rage, yes, but also loss, shock, revulsion, pride curdling into uncertainty. It was the face of a man who had spent years investing emotional money in the wrong account and was now being told the statements had been fake all along. "I'm trying very hard," my father said, "not to make this worse." Ryan let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "For who?" Nobody answered. Because the honest answer was everyone. He looked back at me. "You think this changes anything?" That line should have hurt. Instead it clarified everything. Because buried inside, it was the most Ryan thing Ryan had ever said. Even now, even like this, he thought the important question was where we ranked. Whether the social order still held. Whether I was still beneath him. Whether reality would be allowed to overrule tradition. I said, "It changes one thing for sure." He narrowed his eyes. "What?" "For the first time in your life," I said, "you know what that joke feels like." The room went silent again. Ryan's face went white, then red all over. He looked like he might cry. He looked like he might hit me. He did neither. Instead, he turned back to my mother and asked the ugliest question of the night. "Did you know it might be me?" he said, "and that's why you let them keep doing it to them?" No one moved. My mother's face collapsed in a way it hadn't yet. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like the structure holding it up gave out. Because that was the real accusation. Not the affair. Not even the lie. The choice. Over and over and over again. Did she know the joke might be pointed at the wrong son and let it keep happening because it protected the right one? She opened her mouth. Nothing. That was answer enough. Ryan stumbled back a step. I watched it hit him. Not fully. Not all at once. But enough. Enough for him to understand that what had happened to me might not have been random family stupidity. It might have been management. Damage control. A story allowed to live because it kept suspicion aimed away from him. And once that possibility entered the room, the whole past looked uglier. My father said very slowly, "Did you?" My mother whispered, "I didn't know." Ryan barked out a laugh. "That is not what I asked." She looked at me then. At me. Not at her husband. Not at Ryan. At me. I hated that almost more than the jokes. Because even now, even here, she was reaching for the same thing she had always used me for, the quiet one. The one who would absorb discomfort. The one who wouldn't make a scene. The one who could help the room survive itself just by existing at the edge of it. I didn't save her. I just held her gaze and said nothing. She looked away first. My Aunt Linda finally spoke, voice shaking now. "Carol, were you letting everyone laugh at him because you thought it would keep people from questioning Ryan?" My mother whispered, "It wasn't like that." That's what guilty people say when the wording is accurate enough to scare them. My father heard it too. "Then what was it like?" No answer. He nodded once. "That's what I thought." Ryan dragged both hands through his hair and started pacing beside the table. Gone was the guy who used to own every room. Gone was the lazy grin, the easy insults, the smug certainty. He looked hunted. Worse than hunted. Repositioned. Like the room had redrawn itself around him, and he didn't know the exits anymore. He stopped pacing and looked at me again. This time there was no mockery in it. Only a kind of furious, disbelieving misery. "You knew she got weird when I brought out the kits," he said. "You noticed." "I noticed she got quiet," I said. "And you still did it." I almost said, "You still handed them out." Instead I said, "You've been running this joke since I was 10. He stared at me. Then he gave the tiniest nod. Not agreement. Recognition. The kind that hurts worse than apology because it arrives too late to fix anything. My father sat down heavily, like the anger was getting too large to hold standing up. He looked at the table, at the ruined dinner, at the family he thought he knew, then back at my mother. "One more time," he said. "Who is he?" She swallowed. And in that long second before she answered, I realized something else. The man's name was going to break more than one person. That's why she had held it this long. That's why her silence felt calculated. Whatever came next was not just going to destroy Ryan's certainty. It was going to rearrange the whole family. Then my mother finally spoke. And the name she said made 3 people at the table go dead still before the rest of us even understood why. My mother said, "Dan," just that. One syllable, soft enough that if the room hadn't already been straining toward her, half the table might have missed it. But the 3 people who mattered most didn't miss it. My father went completely still. Aunt Linda made this tiny choking sound and grabbed the edge of the table. And Ryan just stood there with his face emptied out, like his mind had heard the word but refused to let it attach to a person. For a second, the rest of the room didn't catch up. Then it landed. Dan, Uncle Dan, my father's younger brother, the man who had spent every 4th of July in our backyard flipping burgers with sunglasses on. The guy who brought Ryan baseball gloves when he was a kid and called him Champ. The one who missed 2 Thanksgivings in a row when I was in middle school, and everybody said it was because of work, even though Dan had never missed holidays for work in his life. The one who stood next to my father in old family photos, grinning like they were 2 halves of the same joke. That Dan. Nobody breathed. Then Aunt Linda whispered, no, not in disbelief, in recognition. That was worse. My head turned so fast toward her it almost hurt. She was already crying. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just tears suddenly in her eyes like they'd been waiting under the surface for years. As if the name itself had cut a seam open. My father looked at her. That was when the room understood it wasn't just one betrayal. It was layers. My father said very carefully, "You knew." Aunt Linda shook her head immediately. Not new. Not new. But the damage was done. Because that answer belongs to guilty people too. Innocent people say no. Guilty people start sorting degrees. Ryan was looking back and forth between them like he was watching a language he didn't speak. What is happening? No one answered him. So I did the math myself. Uncle Dan was my father's brother. Which meant if Ryan was Dan's son, it explained why everybody had spent his whole life talking about how much he looked like my dad. They were brothers. Same jawline. Same build. Same family bone structure. Ryan didn't look like proof anymore. He looked like camouflage. And suddenly my whole childhood snapped into a shape so ugly I almost felt sick. The jokes about me hadn't survived because they were funny. They had survived because they were useful. As long as the room was laughing at the child who looked different, nobody had to stare too hard at the child who looked just close enough. Ryan said, no, then louder. No, he turned to my mother. You said it wasn't Dan. She was crying now, but still somehow managing to look tired more than devastated, which made me angrier than if she'd fallen apart. People like my mother always seem exhausted by the consequences of the things they chose. I panicked, she whispered. Ryan laughed right in her face. It sounded feral. You panicked. My father pushed back from a table, so hard his chair nearly toppled. How long? The question had changed. Before, it meant how long had she known. Now it meant something worse. How long had it gone on? My mother wiped under one eye, with 2 fingers, like she could fix anything about this, with neat gestures. It was a long time ago. My father said, do not say that to me again. That was the closest I'd ever heard him come to shouting at her. She looked at the table. Before Ryan was born. He stepped toward her. Before he was born is not a length of time, Carol. Nobody moved. Nobody jumped in. Family members who spend years laughing at cruelty are strangely helpless around honesty. My mother finally said, it happened more than once. The room broke open. Aunt Linda covered her mouth fully this time and bent forward like she might throw up. Cousin Nate swore out loud. Somebody near the end of the table stood up and then sat right back down because apparently they had no plan beyond standing. My father looked like he'd been hit in the chest with something blunt and heavy. Ryan just stared at her. Then he looked at my father. Then at me. I knew what he was seeing. Not faces. A timeline. Uncle Dan at birthdays. At cookouts. At games. At Christmas. Maybe teaching him how to throw a baseball. Maybe showing up with gifts. Maybe standing 2 feet away from the man who was actually raising his son and calling it family. I wish I could tell you that in that moment I only felt compassion for Ryan. I didn't. What I felt first was heat. Because every fresh layer of truth made my own past uglier. My mother hadn't simply kept a secret. She had managed a narrative. That is different. A secret is something buried. A narrative is something fed, protected, maintained, repeated until other people start doing the work for you. And that's exactly what had happened to me. My father turned to Aunt Linda. What did you know? She shook her head hard. Not enough. I swear to God, not enough. He stared at her. Tears were running now, and she kept wiping them angrily away, like crying in public offended her. I thought something happened. Years ago, I found messages once. That made everyone at the table look at her. What messages? My father asked. Aunt Linda let out a breath that sounded like it hurt. Dan left his phone in the truck. This was when Ryan was little. Maybe 4? 5? I don't remember. There were texts. Nothing explicit. Not exactly. But enough that I asked him if something had happened between them. She glanced at my mother and then away immediately. He told me I was crazy. Said I was reading flirtation into nothing. We had a huge fight. He didn't speak to me for a week. My father's face had gone beyond anger into something colder. And you stayed. Aunt Linda looked at him with raw shame. I had 2 kids. I had no proof. And then she swallowed. And then everyone kept saying Ryan looked just like you. There it was. The whole rotten machine. Similarity as cover. My face as distraction. Room after room, holiday after holiday. People seeing exactly what was easiest to live with. Ryan turned toward my mother again, and the look on his face then was almost worse than rage. It was humiliation mixed with grief, the kind that makes people feel flayed alive. So every time they joked about him, he pointed at me without even looking. You just let it happen? My mother opened her mouth, closed it. Ryan stepped closer. Did you? She whispered, I never started it. That answer was so vile in its selfishness that even now, sitting here remembering it, I can feel my hands go cold. Not I tried to stop it. Not I was scared. Not I'm sorry. I never started it. As if cruelty only belongs to the first person who says it out loud. As if laughter doesn't count. As if silence doesn't count. As if watching one son absorb suspicion meant for another was somehow morally neutral, because she didn't invent the exact wording. I said, but you let it work. Every head at the table turned toward me. My mother looked at me the way people look at a wound they forgot was still open. I was trying to keep the family together, she said. That line might have worked on somebody else. Not on me. I let out a laugh so sharp it surprised even me. By sacrificing the wrong kid? Nobody told me to calm down. That was new too. My father didn't even look in my direction. He was still staring at my mother like he could barely recognize the person across from him. You let us treat him like an outsider. My mother's shoulders folded inward. I thought if I said anything, it would destroy everything. And there it was. The true religion of families like mine. Not truth. Not fairness. Preservation. People will let one child get slowly humiliated for decades if they believe the alternative is a worse kind of embarrassment for the adults in the room. Ryan sank down into his chair like his legs stopped cooperating. So all those years, no one helped him finish. He didn't need it. All those years, my father praising him, joking with him, claiming him in that big, proud voice. All those years, Ryan weaponizing resemblance. All those years, I got shoved to the far end of tables and turned into a party trick. All those years, my mother watching the wrong son carry the family's question mark, because it was easier than letting the right son become one. And maybe the sickest part was this: it worked. It worked brilliantly. Because nobody suspects a lie when it already has a volunteer target. Aunt Linda looked at me again and started crying harder. I am so sorry. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to accept apologies from people who had enjoyed the joke before discovering it had a better victim. My father sat down slowly, one hand over his mouth. Then he lowered it and looked at me fully for what felt like the first time that night. Not glanced. Looked. And I hated that I knew exactly what was in that look. Regret. Real regret. Late, humiliating, useless regret. I had wanted that look when I was 12, when I was 17, at graduation, at that Christmas table. Not now, after the floor had already collapsed. He said my name once, quiet. I didn't answer him either. Ryan heard that. Of course he did. And because pain had always made him reach for whatever hierarchy was still available, he said, "Oh, so now he matters." The room tightened again. He was crying now, though he clearly didn't realize it yet. His eyes were wet, his voice wrecked, and he still couldn't stop himself from reaching for the same old pattern. Push me down, lift himself up. Even in ruin, he wanted the familiar shape back. My father turned on him, so fast Ryan actually stopped mid-breath. "Do not do that tonight," my father said. Ryan stared at him. I did too, because there it was again, that impossible thing. My father drawing a line. Not in childhood. Not when it could have changed anything foundational. But now that the damage was historic and public and impossible to deny. Ryan laughed bitterly. "Tonight? You mean the one night I'm not allowed to say it?" "You've said enough for 20 years, my father said. That sentence hit Ryan so hard he physically recoiled. And me? I just sat there, because I couldn't decide what felt worse. Hearing my father finally admit the truth, or knowing he had understood enough to say that and still let it go on this long. Ryan looked at him with open disbelief. "So what, now I'm the bad guy?" No one answered. My mother whispered, "Ryan." He whipped around toward her. "Don't." She stopped immediately. "Don't say my name like that," he said. "Not like you get to comfort me." That one went right through her. Good. Then he looked at me, and I braced for something cruel. Instead he said, with this awful broken clarity, "You knew they were using you." I held his stare. "Eventually." He nodded once. "And you stayed." The question under that wasn't hard to hear. "Why didn't you leave? Why did you keep coming back? Why sit at the end of those tables? Why show up for people who had made you their family mascot?" I could have given him the complicated answer. Because leaving family is harder than outsiders think. Because when you grow up in a system, even pain feels like citizenship. Because children will accept almost any role if it means they still get invited to dinner. Instead, I said, "I kept waiting for one of you to notice." No one at that table was ready for that line. You could feel it. All the little histories in the room suddenly tilted toward me. Every joke, every laugh, every time someone chose comfort over correction. It all came rushing back toward the same ugly center. My mother broke first. Not elegantly, not with a controlled tear and a soft apology. She started sobbing. Big, ugly, breathless sobs that would have once made the room rush to soothe her. Nobody moved. That may sound cruel. Maybe it was. But there's a point where watching the person who managed your pain finally drown in her own choices stops feeling tragic and starts feeling overdue. Between sobs, she said, "I didn't know what to do." My father answered her in a flat voice. "You could have told the truth." She shook her head over and over. It would have destroyed everything. He looked around the room, the family, the ruined dinner, Ryan me, and said, "Look around." There was nothing else to add. Ryan stood up again, slower this time, like his body belonged to somebody else. "So what now?" he asked. No one had an answer. And that was terrifying in its own way, because families built on routine can survive unbelievable cruelty as long as nobody asks what happens next. But now the question was sitting in the middle of the table, with the gravy boat and the untouched pie. What now? Was Ryan still my father's son in every way that counted except biology? Was he Uncle Dan's son in the ugliest possible way? Was my mother still anyone's safe place? Was my father grieving a son, a marriage, or his own pride? And what was I supposed to do with the fact that the thing I'd wanted my whole life, to stop being the family's joke, had finally happened in the worst way imaginable? Then Ryan said something so small I almost missed it. He knew, didn't he? My mother looked up. That was answer enough. Ryan's face crumpled. Dan knew. She whispered, "I think so." He let out one broken, disbelieving laugh and wiped at his face with the heel of his hand. Of course he did. That changed the room again. Because betrayal from a mother destroys one part of you. Betrayal from a man who spent your whole life around you while saying nothing destroys another. Ryan looked like he wanted to tear the walls down with his bare hands. Instead, he just stood there shaking. And in that moment, for the first time all night, I felt something close to pity for him. Real pity. Not enough to erase what he'd done to me. Not enough to make me soften the truth. But enough to understand that whatever happened next, he was going to spend the rest of his life replaying childhood through a lens no one should have to survive. Then my father said the one thing I never expected to hear from him. He looked at me and Ryan, then at my mother, and said he was never the one who looked wrong. No one spoke. Because that line didn't just condemn the lie. It condemned all of us. After my father said he was never the one who looked wrong, nobody at the table seemed to know how to inhabit their own body anymore. It's strange what happens after a room reaches maximum damage. You expect screaming. You expect plates breaking, doors slamming, somebody lunging across furniture. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes what happens instead is worse. People start moving very carefully, like the truth has turned the floor to glass, and everyone is afraid the next step will cut them open somewhere new. Ryan was the first one to move. He pushed his chair back, looked around the table like he hated every face there, and then grabbed the edge of the chair again, because for a second it seemed like his balance gave out. He steadied himself, wiped at his face roughly, and gave this short, disbelieving laugh that sounded like it hurt his throat. "So that's it," he said. Nobody answered. He looked at my father. "What am I supposed to call you now?" That hit harder than anything else had. Even my father flinched. Because there are questions no one can answer without sounding monstrous. If he said son, it would sound like pity to Ryan. If he said my name or nothing at all, it would sound like rejection. If he said it doesn't change anything, everyone in the room would hear the lie in it immediately. Because of course it changed something. Not everything, but enough. My father said, "Don't do that." Ryan barked out another laugh. "Don't do what?" Asked the wrong question? Seems like that's kind of the family specialty. No one stopped him. No one told him to calm down. I think we had all finally run out of fake normal. My mother took a step toward him. "Ryan, please." He backed away from her like she was a stranger asking for directions. That stopped her cold. He looked at her with this expression I can still see clearly now. Not just anger, not just betrayal. Revulsion. The kind that comes when a person realizes their entire emotional architecture was built by someone who had access to the blueprints and lied anyway. "You let them do that to him," he said, pointing at me again. "For years." My mother started crying harder. "I was trying to protect you." That was the worst possible thing she could have said. Because it confirmed everything. Not by accident. Not because she was passive. Not because families are messy and jokes get out of hand. Because she had made a choice. Ryan looked at me then, and for the first time in his life, there was no superiority in it at all. Just horror. "She used you," he said. I should tell you that hearing him say it felt good. It didn't. It felt late. It felt like watching somebody finally identify the weapon after the damage was already permanent. I said, yeah. Just that. Because once the truth is that simple, there isn't much to decorate. Ryan swallowed hard and looked away. Then he asked the question I think he had been avoiding since the second the DNA uploaded. Does Dan know? My mother sat down again, like her knees couldn't support lying and crying at the same time. I said I think he does. Ryan's face twisted. That's not an answer. She covered her eyes for a second. He knew there was a chance. A chance. There it was again, that infuriating instinct to soften every blade with foggy language. Ryan said, a chance, and started laughing in that broken way again. A chance? He spent my whole life in this family. Nobody contradicted him. Because he was right. Uncle Dan had been there for birthdays, cookouts, Little League games, Christmas mornings some years, random Saturdays, emergency favors, family photos. He had known my father's routines, my mother's expressions, Ryan's face. He had stood close enough to all of it to feel the heat and still said nothing. My father sat very still, staring at the table in front of him like he was trying to imagine every holiday with one man digitally erased and seeing what remained. Then he said, get him on the phone. Nobody asked who. My mother whispered, I can't. My father looked up, can't or won't. She didn't answer, so he pulled out his own phone. That created a new kind of panic in the room. Don't, my mother said immediately, standing up again. Please don't call him right now. My father unlocked the phone. Why? Afraid the wrong people are about to hear the truth. She actually reached for his wrist. He pulled away, so fast she looked burned. That was the exact moment it became obvious the marriage was over. Not because he moved. Because of how instinctive it was. No hesitation. No performance. Just total bodily rejection. Aunt Linda stood up too. Tom, wait. He looked at her. You don't get a vote. She took that like she deserved it. Which she did. Ryan ran both hands over his face and said, call him. Nobody looked surprised that the request came from him. If anything, the room had been waiting for it. My father looked at Ryan for a long second. Then at the phone. Then finally set it back down on the table without dialing. That choice surprised all of us. Not because he was being merciful. Because he had realized something. Calling Dan would not answer the question Ryan actually wanted answered. There is no phone call in the world that gives a son his childhood back. Ryan saw it too, and his whole body seemed to sag in on itself. Then my father did something that would have meant everything to me 10 years earlier and almost nothing to me now. He looked straight at me and said, I should have stopped it. The room went silent again. My mother lowered her hands from her face. Aunt Linda stared. Ryan closed his eyes. I heard the words. I understood them. I even believed them. My father was not saying them because the room demanded a performance. He was saying them because the machinery of denial had finally broken down enough for him to hear his own history clearly. I should have stopped it. Simple sentence. Devastatingly late. He kept going. Every time he said it. Every time anybody said it. I should have stopped it. I looked at him. Really looked at him. At the man who had laughed at my graduation. At Christmas. At dinner. The man who had loved Ryan loudly and treated me like I'd been assembled from spare parts. The man who now seemed to understand all at once that even if Ryan turned out not to be his biological son, that did not erase his failure toward the child who was. There was regret there. Real regret. But regret is a poor substitute for protection. I said, yeah. He nodded like he deserved no more than that. He was right. My mother tried to speak then, but Ryan cut across her. Don't. His voice was flat now, emptied out by overuse. She stopped. He looked at me again, and I could tell he was trying to build a sentence that didn't sound like him. That alone was almost surreal. Ryan, who always had a line ready. Ryan, who could weaponize a room in under 10 seconds. Ryan, standing in the ruins of his own favorite joke with no script left. Finally he said, I didn't know. It wasn't enough. It also wasn't nothing. I believed him, at least in the narrowest sense. He had not known the biology. He had not known the secret arrangement under the house. But ignorance can still be cruel when it grows arrogant enough to turn another person's pain into entertainment. I said, you knew you liked it. That landed harder than a longer speech would have. He looked down. Because yes, he had liked it. Liked being the obvious one. Liked having me there as contrast. Liked the easy power of being the child nobody questioned. Liked the laughs. Liked watching the room choose him without even knowing it was choosing. I was a kid, he said. You were a kid when you started, I said. You weren't a kid at graduation. He shut his mouth. That was the first time in my life I had ever won a silence against Ryan. Not by outshouting him. By telling the truth in a room that finally had no defense left. My Aunt Linda whispered, he's right. No one thanked her for finally arriving at the scene of the crime. Ryan looked like he might say something mean just from muscle memory. The line even seemed to reach his mouth. Then it died there. Maybe because he no longer had the authority to carry cruelty the way he used to. Maybe because for once he could hear how ugly it would sound. Maybe because there are limits to what even a selfish person can say when their entire identity is lying in pieces under a Thanksgiving centerpiece. He turned toward the hallway. My mother said, Ryan, where are you going? He answered without looking back. Away from you. Then he walked out. Not dramatic. Not stomping. Not shouting. He just left the dining room, crossed the foyer, grabbed his coat from a rack with a movement so sharp the hanger snapped. And a second later the front door slammed hard enough to rattle the framed family photos on the wall. No one followed him immediately. That said a lot too. All those years Ryan had been the gravitational center of every room, and now his exit left behind not panic, but exhaustion. My mother collapsed into the nearest chair and started sobbing again. My father did not go to her. Aunt Linda sat down slowly like her bones had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. Cousin Nate disappeared into the kitchen under the transparent excuse of getting water for people who clearly needed different forms of intervention. I just sat there, phone still on the table, half-eaten Thanksgiving dinner all around us. The DNA results still glowing calmly on those stupid screens, as if numbers and percentages had any business being that clean after what they had done to the room. After a minute, my father stood up. I thought he was finally going after Ryan. He wasn't. He walked over to the mantel, took down one of the framed family pictures from a few Christmases earlier, looked at it for 3 seconds, and set it face down on the sideboard. That picture had me standing at the edge, Ryan in the center, my father's hand on his shoulder. I knew the exact one without even seeing it. He stayed there with his back to us and said, I need everybody to leave. No one argued. That's the thing about authority. Even broken, it still echoes. Chairs scraped. Coats got picked up. Quiet, frightened little goodbyes were offered by people who had laughed plenty over the years, but suddenly wanted to sound gentle on the way out. Aunt Linda stopped near me and touched the back of my chair lightly. I am sorry, she said. I looked up at her and asked, were you sorry before tonight? She started crying again. That answer was enough. She left. Nate paused too, but he didn't try an apology. He just looked ashamed and nodded once like he knew words would cheapen it. Then he followed the others out. That left me, my parents, and the sound of my mother trying and failing to pull air into her lungs evenly. My father finally turned around. He looked older than he had 3 hours earlier. Not dramatically, just unmistakably. Like some private scaffolding had been kicked away from inside him. He said my name again. This time I answered. What? He flinched a little at the coldness in it, which was almost insulting. What had he expected? Warmth? Gratitude for the timing of his moral awakening? He said I was wrong. I nodded. You were. He swallowed. I don't know how to fix this. That finally felt honest. Because there are parents who say they don't know how to fix things, when what they really mean is they want credit for trying. My father looked like a man who had actually, finally understood that some things do not get fixed. They get carried. My mother lifted her head and said through tears, "Please don't leave like this." I looked at her, really looked. At the woman who had watched me grow up under a suspicion she privately knew might belong elsewhere. The woman who had laughed when it was easier, stayed quiet when it was convenient, chosen preservation over truth and called it love. Then I stood up. She must have seen something in my face, because she started crying harder. "Please." I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. On my way past Ryan's empty seat, I stopped. My father looked at me. My mother looked at me. The whole room seemed to pause around that chair, around that place of honor by my father's side, the one Ryan had occupied for so many years like it had been assigned at birth. And maybe it had been, just not by blood. I put one hand on the chair back and said, "You know what the worst part is?" No one answered. I looked at my mother first, then my father. "It wasn't the joke," I said. "It was watching the two people who knew better laugh along." My mother made this broken sound in the back of her throat. My father closed his eyes. Then I looked toward the foyer where Ryan had disappeared and said the line I had carried since I was 10. "Are you sure you weren't switched at birth?" I didn't yell it. I didn't need to. In a house like mine, the quiet version always cuts deeper. And before either of my parents could say another word, I walked out. The cold outside hit me hard enough to make my eyes water, but I kept going, past the driveway, past Ryan's car, past the windows glowing warm. Behind me, like that house, still had a right to call itself home. I stood at the curb for a second and listened to the muffled sound of voices rising again inside. But this time none of them were about me. For 23 years, my family treated me like the question mark in the photo. Last Thanksgiving, the DNA results finally proved I belonged there. Turns out the only person who didn't was the one who taught everybody to laugh first.